out for 2 minutes. I'll be back.
By the way, let me know before we do it. He's had an opportunity to review all these.
I think that's good enough.
Okay.
Is that good?
All right, to the jury, please. Be seated, please.
Proceed for the sitting.
Thank you, Judge. Investigator Martin Jackson. Good morning.
Good morning.
away from me, please, sir. Come this way, sir. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Raise your right hand. That you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you should give to the court and jury on this now being to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Thank you. Thank you. Morning again, sir. If you will, introduce yourself to the jurors, and how about spelling your first and last name for our court reporter?
Good morning. Martin Jackson, MartinJackson.
And Ms. Investigator Jackson, where are you employed, sir?
I'm employed with the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office.
And how long have you been with the medical examiner's office?
I've been with the medical examiner's for 5 years and 2 months.
And why don't you explain a little bit about your background, what brought you to the medical examiner's office, and what specifically do you do with them?
Absolutely. My career in the death industry started at a young age. I have a family member that owns a funeral home. I would work there off and on while in college. Once I graduated from college, I started working there full-time, worked my way up to the general manager position. From that point, I got a job with the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office as a forensic technician, where I worked hands-on very closely with the forensic pathologists, where we performed autopsies together. Stayed there for a few years. Then I got a job with the Cobb County School District, where I taught public safety and forensics. Did that for a few years. Then I got the job as a senior forensic technician with Forensic Medicine Associates, which is under the direction of Dr. Gerald Gowan, who was the chief medical examiner at the DeKalb County Medical Examiner's Office, and we worked out of that facility. I worked there until I got the job with the medical examiner's office here in Cobb County.
What's the difference between a forensic technician versus an investigator?
A forensic technician, they actually work in the laboratory with the doctors, and they help the doctors to perform the autopsies, whereas the investigator, we respond to scenes, and when we go out to scenes, we're responsible for the deceased individual. While we're at a scene, we gather information, we document the scene, we do an examination on the deceased, we prepare the deceased to be transported back to the medical examiner's office. That information is then relayed to the medical examiner who performs the examination.
And are you a participant in the external and the internal examination of a deceased individual in a homicide investigation?
Yes, I'm present.
Okay. And the medical examiner for Cobb County at the time of this autopsy was Dr. Brian Priss, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I want to talk a little bit about your role on a crime scene. This jury's already heard a little bit about that from a crime scene investigator, Shumpert. Do you know who Brad Shumpert is?
Yes, I do.
And have you worked with him before?
Yes, a lot, yes.
Okay. And he works with Cobb County Police Department.
Yes, he does.
Now, there was a discussion that I had with him about the role of the crime scene investigator versus the forensic investigator that comes from the medical examiner's office. Why don't you just articulate for our record and for the jury what the distinction is? What are you responsible for versus what is the crime scene investigator responsible for?
Thank you. As a death investigator, I'm responsible for the deceased individual. When I arrive on scene, my first job is to contact the local law enforcement officer that's in charge, whether it be the detective, lieutenant, who's ever in charge. I gather information from him or her, and we talk about the scene. He lets me know what's going on. From that point, I do an examination of the deceased. My sole priority is the deceased individual. So that's where my focus and that's where my responsibility is. When I'm working with law enforcement, we work together, we perform parallel investigations together. And as I'm doing my external examination of the deceased, typically they'll be there with me and they'll take photographs as I'm proceeding with my external examination. If there's something there that I want a specific photograph of, or I think that may be something that they need to take a photo of, they take a picture of that for us.
And is this a fairly routine practice that you would work with, for instance, Cobb County Police Department and Investigator Shumpert, and ask them to document certain aspects of the body as you're examining on scene?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And is it routine that thereafter you would transport the body, or who's responsible for that?
I'm responsible for transporting the body to the medical examiner's office once our examination has been completed on scene, and once we have determined that the body is ready to be removed to the medical examiner's office.
And do you make that call when you're ready to remove the body?
Well, in conjunction with law enforcement, we determine together when it's time to move the deceased.
Okay. Do you always do the autopsy on the same day that you respond to a scene, or does it sometimes happen afterwards?
Sometimes afterwards. It depends on the doctor.
I want to direct your attention to this particular case. In June 18th of 2014, Were you called upon to respond to the scene near Acres Mill Road involving the death investigation of young Cooper Harris?
Yes, sir.
And why don't you explain for the jury about when did you get that call and about when did you respond?
Okay. I got a call from a detective with the Cobb County Police Department. The call came in approximately 17:15 hours, which is 5:15 p.m. Advised me that I needed to respond to the scene that a deceased was found lifeless in his father's vehicle, and I was asked to respond to the scene. I arrived at the scene approximately 17:50 hours, where I met with local law enforcement, and where we talked about the scene and where they gave me information pertaining to the incident that had just occurred.
Okay, and the scene that we're specifically referring to, was that on or about 29, I think it was 2955 Acres Mill, is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes, sir.
And,
Acre Mill Road.
and is that in Cobb County, Georgia?
Yes, sir.
And upon arriving there, what did you note? What did you observe?
Well, when I first got there, I observed Cobb County Police Department. They was taking measurements and taking photographs of the scene. And I waited until they told me that they were done with their process before I was able to go and start my process.
Okay, and when you arrived, was Cooper Harris's body, was it already covered up?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and can you describe, generally speaking, the weather conditions when you arrived?
It was clear, sunny, in the upper 80s at the time when I arrived at the scene. It was very warm out.
Okay. And did you initially assess the scene and figure out what it is that you needed to do as the crime scene investigator from the medical examiner's office?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. And where specifically did you find Cooper Harris's body when you first arrived?
He was laying on the pavement, covered by a white sheet, located very close to this vehicle.
I want to show you some photographs that have already been admitted into evidence. This jury saw these last week or the week before. This is State's Exhibit 42. Is this the scene as you found it when you first arrived?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I'm not going to use the Mondo pad at this point, but looking at State's 42, was Cooper Harris's body located under this sheet?
Yes, sir.
And then after removing the sheet, I'm going to show you State's 51. Is that a fair and accurate depiction of Cooper Harris as you found him when you began your investigation on scene?
Yes, sir.
All right. You're familiar with terms rigor and lividity?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And is it part of your responsibility as an investigator with the medical examiner's office to document things such as the condition of the body?
Yes, sir.
Can you just explain generally to this jury how you found Cooper Harris's body when you began your investigation at Acres Mill?
Okay, once I got the clearance that I can go ahead and do my examination, I removed the sheet. And during my examination, one of the first things I look for is postmortem changes, which consists of rigor mortis. Rigor mortis, which is stiffening of muscles once death has occurred, and also I look for livor mortis, which is the blood is no longer circulating through the body, and the blood settled to its lowest point due to gravity. It's identified by this purplish, reddish color. Those are things that I look for during my examination to determine whether or not someone is deceased.
And in this particular case, did you note either of those two things?
Absolutely.
Rigor mortis and lividity.
Yes, rigor mortis was present, and livor mortis was present as well.
Let's talk about the different types of rigor mortis. Did you sometimes differentiate between being fixed versus moderate versus having no rigor mortis?
Right, well, rigor mortis can be firm or it can be moderate. And in this situation, rigor mortis was moderate.
And can you explain to the jury what you mean by moderate versus being fixed or firm?
Absolutely. Firm rigor mortis is when rigor mortis has set and you can't really manipulate any of the extremities. As I was manipulating the extremities of the deceased, I was able to manipulate his extremities with ease, and so the rigor mortis released. So that's why I say it was moderate. I didn't have to force it. So when I went to manipulate his extremities, they did release.
And what about lividity? Did you find that to be present in Cooper Harris's body?
Yes, and the lividity was not fixed. What that means is the lividity was present on the skin. Once I put pressure or you apply pressure onto the skin, you will see that the skin tend to blanch, which means it's an area that moves away, and you can see your imprint of your fingerprint or your hand or whatever you put there to determine whether or not the lividity is fixed or non-fixed.
I want to show you State's Exhibit 57. Do you recognize that as being a fair and accurate depiction of the right arm of Cooper Harris?
Yes.
And whose blue gloves are those in this photograph?
That was mine.
Okay, so this is you actually manipulating Cooper Harris on scene to determine rigor and lividity?
Yes, sir.
All right, so looking at State's Exhibit 57, that purplish discoloration on the right arm of Cooper Harris, what is that, sir?
That's lividity.
That's the blood pooling to the elbow?
That's correct. As blood has settled to the lowest point of the body at that point, and it's none fixed.
I want to show you a couple of other photographs as well. At some point, you actually turned Cooper Harris over and put him on a sheet. Is that correct? Is that fairly routine that you would put him on a sterilized white sheet?
Sometimes I do that, and in this situation, Cooper had already been lying on the hot pavement, and when I went to do my external examination, I also have to do an examination of his back as well. When I got ready to manipulate him, I made a decision out of respect for Cooper Harris that I did not want to place him face down on the hot pavement with his face resting into the hot blacktop. So I put the sheet down there as integrity and out of respect for him.
This is State's Exhibit number 66. Do you see your hands in the photograph here, State 66, after having turned Cooper Harris over?
Yes.
And looking at State 66, the back of his legs, do you see that lividity present there that you given testimony about?
Yes, sir.
All right. And that's your blue gloved hand in State's Exhibit 66, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. We had heard some testimony about this. He was wet on the back, the wet discoloration on the back of his clothing,
Yes.
back of his shirt. Did you note that as well?
I did.
Okay. And did you have an occasion, I'm showing you now in the States, you can probably see that better on State 71. You see that discoloration for the wetness around his diaper and his back?
Yes, sir.
Okay. When you looked at Cooper Harris, did you note that he appeared to be sweaty and had a diaper that was soiled?
Yes, I did.
Did you smell an odor while you were manipulating?
Just so there was a odor of urine present.
Okay. And this is State 66. Do you see that the top of the diaper just above that wet portion
Yes.
on the bottom of the shorts, or top of the shorts? Sticking with lividity for a second, I wanted to just show you one other photo. This is State's Exhibit number 78. Did you also raise his wet shirt to look at whether there was evidence of lividity on his back?
I did, yes.
And look at State 78, what does that depict?
That depict that lividity is present with a little bit of blanching as well.
And explain what blanching is.
Blanching is when that part of the skin was in contact with some type of surface. Therefore, when the blood began to settle, it settled around that area. Typically, it looks like an injury, but it's not. It's consistent with blanching.
Now, as you were going through the process of documenting the scene and making note of what you observed, were you telling Investigator Shumpert that he needed to take certain photographs, some of which have been depicted here for the jury?
Yes, there's a few.
I want to ask you about the diaper in particular. Did you remove the diaper there on scene, or was that removed later?
It was removed later. I remember it on scene. No, it was removed later, but I remembered it being there on scene.
All right. When it was removed later, did you note whether there was any urine present?
Yes, urine was present.
Oh, and just to be fair, was there any feces?
No, it was urine was present in the diaper.
So, consistent with what you saw and smelled on scene, did you find urine to be in the diaper?
Yes.
What about the deceased Cooper Harris's pupils? Did you make any notes about his pupils, and what's the significance of that?
His pupils was fixed and dilated. What that means is there was no response to any type of stimuli at all.
What about any abrasions? Did you note any abrasions while on scene? Let's stick there before we get to the autopsy. Did you note any abrasions on Cooper Harris's body?
Yes.
And describe, just generally speaking, where you saw those. You don't need to be too terribly specific.
Okay, we had abrasions on his head. He had abrasions on his back, on his extremities as well.
And I want to ask you specifically about Cooper Harris's color. When you raised his shirt, we've seen some pictures of the lividity that you talked about, but did you get an opportunity to look at his abdomen?
Yes.
And can you describe for the jury, generally speaking, what was the color of his abdomen?
There was an area of light green discoloration present on the abdomen.
This is State's Exhibit 51. Looking at 51, the shirt's not fully lifted, but you see that's partially lifted here?
Yes, I do.
Okay. That area of discoloration, can you see that partially exposed here? The
Partially.
Green discoloration?
Yes, partially.
All right. during the course of your investigation in this case, were you able to determine deceased victim's date of birth?
Yes.
Okay, and do you recall what that is?
I do not.
Did you document it in your
I did
report?
document it in my report.
If you need to refresh your recollection, please feel free.
August 2nd, 2012.
That would make him 22 months old, is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Now, after doing your documentation from the scene, did you in fact transport Cooper Harris somewhere?
I transferred him to the Cobb County Medical Examiner's office.
And describe what happens once you get to the medical examiner's office. First of all, how close is that to the Acres Mill?
It was about 20 minutes away. Depending on traffic, it was traffic at that time. Once I leave a scene, what I do is I secure the deceased. I place him in our vehicle and I transport him to the medical examiner's office. Once I get to the medical examiner's office, I have to sign the decedent into what is our morgue area, log them in, and I placed him in our morgue area, completed my report, and at that time he's ready to be for the examination to occur the next day.
When you initially assessed Cooper Harris's body, can you describe what his temperature was by feel?
Yes, he was very warm.
Warm to the touch?
Very hot, yes, sir.
And once you get to the morgue, explain how those conditions are different before the autopsy.
Well, the morgue is a very cold environment, and of course it'll bring the temperature down while he's there, and he was there overnight prior to the examination beginning the next day.
You did the actual autopsy with Dr. Priz. That happened the next day, is that correct?
Yes, I was present, yes.
And that was June the 19th of 2014.
Yes, sir.
In that interim period of time, where was Cooper Harris's body maintained?
He was in our facility, within our facility.
And specifically, was it in a cooled facility?
Yes, correct, yes.
All right, now I want to ask you a little bit about your role in getting a medical history from a deceased victim. Is that part of your responsibility as an investigator?
Yes, sir.
And where do you usually get the history of a deceased victim in a case such as this?
Typically it would come from a family member.
Did you attempt to get a history from Leanna Harris for Cooper Harris in this particular case?
Yes, sir, I did.
Were you able to get that history from her, and was she cooperative with you?
No, sir, she wasn't, and no, I was not able to get a history.
You were not able to get a history from Leanna Harris on her son?
No, sir.
Did Leanna Harris direct you to somebody else to get that history?
Yes, she advised I would need to talk to her attorney, or she had already released that information to a detective with the Cobb County Police Department.
Okay. But she wouldn't give it to you?
That's correct.
Did you contact Cobb Police Department to see if you could obtain sufficient information such that you could get medical records for Cooper Harris?
I did. I talked to the Cobb County Police Department to get his primary care physician, who I then contacted to request, and I subpoenaed a copy of his medical record.
All right. I'm going to show you states 368 previously shown to defense counsel. We had an opportunity to look at this morning. Looking at 368, do you recognize this as being a certified copy of Cooper Harris's Kaiser Permanente records?
Yes, sir.
I tender states 368.
No objection.
Admitted.
For these records, 368 that have been shown to the jury for Cooper Harris, how were you able to obtain those once you got the information from Cobb County Police Department?
I contacted the primary care physician, in this case, Kaiser Permanente. I requested a copy of his medical records through a subpoena. So we subpoenaed those records. Those records was then sent to us once they had received the subpoena.
And did you share those records with Dr. Frist and review those records as part of the autopsy procedure and the death investigation in this case?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall when you got those records?
I have to refer to my report.
If you can.
They were received on July 3rd, 2014.
All right. And having received and reviewed those records with Dr. Frist, did you find that Cooper Harris, prior to his death, was an otherwise healthy young boy?
Yes, sir.
And did you note that? Was that noted in the medical examiner's report?
Yes, sir.
As part of this investigation, I want to fast forward to July the 8th of 2014. Do you recall being tasked with observing something that occurred on July the 8th of 2014?
Yes, sir.
And why don't you explain for the jury what it is that you were asked to observe and participate in on that day?
Okay, they were doing a heat study to analyze the heat temperatures in the car throughout the day. I was asked to respond and be present for that so that I can document that information, get that information. I can take that back to our medical examiner, Dr. Frisch, who was doing that examination, so he can be aware of what was the conditions similar to that day possibly would have been.
All right. On July the 18th of 2014, did you travel to the Home Depot treehouse, and were you present with investigators with the Cobb County Police Department and an investigator named Brainy while heat analysis was performed on the Tucson?
Yes, sir.
And once you arrived on scene, was that Tucson actually placed in a specific parking spot such that this heat analysis could be conducted?
Yes, sir.
And just describe, generally speaking, the conditions that day. Was it hot that day?
Yes, it was hot.
And approximately how long were you there for that heat analysis to observe that?
I was there for a few hours, typically to stay and document as much as I can.
All right. Now, in terms of the registering of the actual temperatures themselves, did you do that, or was that somebody else, some other investigator, some other scientist that was doing that?
Some other scientists did that part.
You were just there to
I was
observe
there,
it?
yes, sir.
All right. As part of this investigation, fast forward to a different topic, you're aware that Cobb Police and the District Attorney's Office had a life-size doll made of Cooper Harris. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And have you seen that doll?
Yes, sir.
Were measurements taken of Cooper Harris during the autopsy procedure?
Yes, sir.
And having looked at that doll that was created in anticipation for this case, can you confirm, did you actually meet with me on a couple occasions when confirm the validity and accuracy of the size of the doll?
Yes, sir.
All right. All right, Investigator Jackson, I think that's all I have for you at this time. Thank you, sir.
Cross examiner.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
For 5 years plus with the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office.
Ms. Long, I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah, if I can get these records real quick.
Sure.
Just didn't want to get them before you got started.
For 5 years plus with the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office, is that the only medical examiner's office that you've worked for?
Officially, yes. I worked for Forensic Medicine Associates, which is a private pathology firm under the direction of Dr. Gerald Gowitt, but we worked out of the DeKalb County Medical Examiner's Office. So actually, I worked in conjunction with the DeKalb County Medical Examiner's Office and Forensic Medicine Associates. Being an associate, being an employee with Forensic Medicine Associates allowed me to work at the DeKalb County Medical Examiner's Office.
Very good. And was that concurrent with the time in Cobb County, or was that before your time in Cobb?
That was before my time in Cobb.
Very good. All right. And prior to that, do you have any sort of law enforcement experience specifically outside of?
I do not.
In other words, you've never been a police officer, certified, or anything of that nature? All right, very good. And your work as a medical examiner's investigator, does that require any sort of particular training or education in order to do that?
Typically, there is no education requirements. There is training. I am board certified with the American Board of Medical Legal Death Investigators.
All right. And so there's some sort of training or class you go through to get that out?
Yes, I have to have continuing education to keep my certification.
Very good. And that training involves just kind of make sure you understand how to deal with a scene where there's a death, particularly the body, and logging information, keep track of information.
Yes, sir.
Right. And it's real important when you're, as the ME's investigator, when you go to the scene, the ME doesn't actually go to the scene with you on most occasions. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes, sir.
All right. And is it fair to say that your job there is to kind of be the eyes, the ears, the nose, the feet, the hands of the ME so that you can let him or her know exactly what you saw and observed there in that sense?
Yes, sir.
And you want to document that as much as possible in your report so that they can read it and kind of catch up with it in addition to asking you about it.
That's correct, yes, sir.
And On this occasion, when you got called out, who contacts you to let you know to go out there?
Typically, the police department will contact me to
Okay.
let me know that a death has occurred and they would need for me to respond to a scene.
Do they just call you on the phone or
Yes.
something? Okay, because you're not wired into their channels or anything like that to
No,
hear
sir.
the radio traffic?
No, sir.
All right. So when you first heard about this, was it from the police department contacting you, or had you heard otherwise about this incident?
The police department.
Very good. And when you were first contacted about that, do you remember what time that was?
It was approximately about 17, 15 hours.
Okay. And so 17:15, is that 5:15
Yes,
p.m.?
yes, I'm sorry, yes.
That's good. Were you advised at that time whether or not this was being considered a crime scene or not?
No, at that time I was just told that the deceased was discovered lifeless in his father's vehicle and that I should respond to the scene.
Very good. And so when you got there were already, obviously, law enforcement folks there. Did you see any emergency responders, such as EMS personnel?
No, sir.
All right. Were any of the fire trucks still on the scene?
No, sir.
All right. And it's all you saw was law enforcement personnel, and I presume some public people maybe gathering.
Far as I can remember, yes, sir.
Very good. And as I understand it, you just kind of stayed outside the perimeter, if you will, where the tape is set up until they told you they were ready for you to come in.
Yes, sir.
And that's typical.
Yes,
right?
sir.
All right. And when you went into the scene, did you meet with anybody particular to kind of show you where anything particular was?
Right. When I arrived at the scene, I initially spoke with Lieutenant Farrell of the Cobb County Police Department.
And did you know Lieutenant Farrell prior to this?
Just in passing, but not in general, no, sir.
Okay. And is there any reason why you would be talking to him as opposed to anybody else on the scene?
Well, at the time, he was the one that was in control of the scene. The other detectives had stepped away at the time that I have arrived.
Was your understanding he was the highest ranking officer there at the time?
Yes.
And did he brief you on the information that they had at that point in time?
Yes, he did.
And in his briefing of you, did he indicate to you how he wanted you to treat this thing?
He didn't so much indicate to me. He just explained to me that foul play could not be ruled out. Anytime that law enforcement explain that or tell us that to the medical examiner's office, we tend to work that case as a homicide. So which means we process it differently.
Very good. And did you question him as to whether or not anyone had actually been interviewed yet?
No, I don't remember the question.
Did he indicate to you that anyone had been interviewed at that point in time?
At that point, they were still in the middle of their investigation.
You say in the middle of it, they were actually really on the very front end.
But they were still in the beginning.
They were just there on the
Yes,
scene.
yes, sir.
Very
I'm
good.
sorry.
Do you remember ever seeing Mr. Harris, the father of the child, there on the scene when you got there?
I do not.
Yeah, so you don't know if he was even still there or not at
I
that
do
point in
not.
time?
No.
All right. And then you, once you done on some protective equipment, that's gloves, footies, maybe even a whole suit, I don't know. Tell us exactly what you would do to make precautions to make sure that you don't taint the scene.
Yeah, what I did is I put on a full crime scene suit, which includes a full body suit, along with a mask and gloves.
All right, very good. And did you notice, was anybody else wearing similar items like that, or just you?
Just me.
All right. And did you speak to anyone about who had placed the sheet over Cooper's body?
No, I don't recall speaking with anyone about that.
And so as you came into the scene, did you go straight to Cooper's body itself, or do you walk around the car or anything of that nature?
Well, once I put on my crime scene suit, that's my process. When I go straight to the deceased and I begin my examination on the deceased.
Very good. When the sheet was raised, who assisted you, I guess, in taking the sheet off Cooper and being there as you were looking at his body?
I took the sheet off myself, but crime scene investigator Shumpert was present with me
All right.
inside the scene.
Yeah, and was he the one that had the camera taking pictures?
Yes, sir.
All right. Was there anybody else there assisting you?
No, just
All right. Just the two of y'all?
yeah, there was a lot of police around,
Right.
but not assisting us.
Okay. Right there with Cooper's body, it's just the two of you?
No.
Okay. And when you took the sheet off, of course, you're looking at Cooper and you're seeing some of these things you talked about, with the apparent rigor mortis that you can see before you even touched him, and the liver mortis, correct?
Yes, sir.
And were there any measurements that you would have taken there on the scene initially when you get there?
No, sir.
Okay. And you then start, well, tell us, what's the first thing you would have done with Cooper's body?
First thing is I would have took the sheet off, and then I would have let the crime scene technician take photos of him as he was with the sheet removed.
All right. And then when you first touch his body, what would be the first thing you would do?
I typically would start at the head, or I start at the chest area.
Okay. And are you just looking around at the body for signs of anything?
I'm doing an external examination and looking for any type of evidence, maybe any type of injuries. Also, I'm looking for post-mortem changes as well.
Okay. And is this the first such scene of this nature where you're dealing with a small child that ultimately we know died of the heat? Have you ever dealt with a scene of that nature before?
No. As far as hyperthermia death, no.
All right, very good. And so typically when you go to a scene, there's a gunshot wound or a stab wound, or there might be a poisoning, or there might be even an older person who may have died. That you're looking for an obvious indication of what the cause of death is.
Yes, sir.
All right. And even though at the time you got there, had you gotten any indication as to what had been the cause of Cooper's death at that point in time?
Well, just the fact that he was left inside of a hot vehicle.
Okay, so that information had been given to you?
Yes.
All right. You remember who it was that gave you that information?
The detective with the Cobb County Police Department.
Okay. Would that have been Lieutenant Farrell? Or
No, I'm
somebody
going to say
else?
Detective Racy when he first
Racy.
called. Yes.
Very good. So when he first called you, he gave you that information?
Yes. Mhm.
I got you. All right. Did you see him there on scene when you got there?
I did not recall seeing him.
Okay. And, but there were a bunch of people there, so you
That's
had
correct.
that-
My main focus was on the deceased.
Absolutely. And so as you start looking for injuries, is that you're actually moving the body around at that point in time
Yes.
to look front, back, top, bottom, correct?
Yes.
All right. And when you did that, we've seen several photographs already that a crime scene technician, Shumpert, has talked to us about. And I think we see some of the pictures, as was indicated earlier, the blue gloves and whatnot.
Mhm.
We see that. You're the one that would be wearing, no one else is wearing that sort of
That's correct.
stuff.
Yes.
All right. And when you start moving the body around, did you actually, I think you said that you were able to move the extremities,
Well,
which means arms and legs?
I was able to manipulate him with a little force. The rigor mortis was moderate, so yes, I was
Very
able
good.
to.
Very good. And does that mean you could actually stretch them out all the way?
No, typically I was able to manipulate him.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
But it's a possibility, yes.
Okay. Your job is just trying to look around and see what you could see and then photograph whatever might need to be
My
photographed.
job is to document the scene and the deceased. That's my job, is the deceased.
And at some point, you recall looking into the vehicle as well.
Yes, I glanced at it. Yes, sir, I went through the vehicle.
Very good. And just to kind of get an idea of where the car seat was, where he was seated, that sort of thing, correct?
Yes.
And you recall if you had to open any doors to do that, or if you just looked in the driver's door, do you remember?
I just looked at the driver's door.
All right, very good. And that's part of what you do, just again, to get an overall view of what's happening.
Right, that's not my responsibility, is that part of the scene.
All right. But it is part of your responsibility to make sure you can document for the medical examiner, here's kind of what we're seeing going on here.
Yes, sir.
Very good. And as you are looking at Cooper and manipulating, we saw some photographs of actually pulling of Cooper's diaper down so that you could see some of his backside and liver mortis there, blanching, that sort of thing, correct?
Yes, yes.
I know you don't know that, but having seen those pictures, you were part of doing that.
Yes.
All right. And when we see this very white coloration on the backside, that'd be consistent with him having been laying there on the ground, correct?
It's called blanching.
Blanching.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And I can't say if it's considered him laying on the ground or from being when he was sitting in the car seat, but it was present.
It's him laying on that part of his body, so there's pressure on it.
That part of the skin was in contact with something, yes.
Very good. And so when we see that on elbows or legs or knees or whatnot, it could be, at some point, there was some pressure on there after the pulling had begun.
Yes, sir.
I think he said, even in some of these pictures, we see where as you're touching the body, it's causing that blanching yourself, correct?
That's correct, yes.
All right, and so as you were there, you moved Cooper's body around multiple ways to turn him around, to look on his backside, lifting up his shirt, pulling down his shorts, pulling down the diaper, a lot of movement, correct? And you certainly aren't able to, you never observed or had an opportunity to see Cooper Harris actually while he was in the car seat?
No, sir.
All right. And exactly where he was sitting or anything that would have been moved in the car seat prior to his getting out of the car, you would have no way of knowing that.
No.
Very good. And so as you're talking with, I keep on calling him Investigator Shumpert, CST, I guess,
Yes.
Shumpert. You're kind of explaining to him, hey, here's what I'm seeing, take a picture of this. Here's what I'm seeing on the backside, take a picture of this.
Yeah, well, usually, while I'm doing my external examination, he's going around and he's taking photos. If there's something there that I think that should be photographed, I ask him to take a photograph.
And as you were there doing that, do you recall anybody else coming up to y'all to talk to you about anything they wanted to see or have a picture taken up?
No.
All right, just two of them.
Yes.
And as you were moving the body around and whatnot, you said that you smelled the urine in the diaper,
Yes.
correct? And when you pulled the diaper down, were you able to note it then as well?
You can feel
Just
that.
feel
Yes.
that it was full?
Yes.
Okay. And when you were going through that process, that the amount of time for y'all to get all those photographs taken, any idea how long that was?
It's variable. It varies.
Okay.
So I don't have an
In
exact.
this particular case, you remember if it was more than an hour, less than an hour?
For me to do my process, it would have been less than an hour for
Less than
me.
an hour.
Yes.
Very good. And that includes everything from you starting, going to look at him until you're ready to transport.
From the time that I put on my crime scene suit and start my external examination, and I prepare him to be transported to the medical examiner's office, that is less than an hour.
Very good. All right, and after you do all your work, then of course you prepare a report for the medical examiner, correct?
That's correct.
And have you had a chance to review your report prior to your testimony? Do you have a copy with you?
I do have a copy.
Very good. All right. And let's just kind of look at that and see what you note there. On the front page, there's a block there indicating incident investigation. And it's where you note rigor and lividity on there. And there's also the initials DOS. What does that refer to?
Dead on scene.
Okay. I'm sorry. That's a death on scene. Very good. And then the next column you've got noting drug or injuries or decomposed. And none of those are indicated, correct?
Mhm.
All right. And then seatbelts, alcohol, lab case, none of those are indicated. And note, charges, prisoner, none of those are indicated. And then scene and scene 2, you have check scene. That's just indicating that you were at the one scene.
Based off of our database, scene 2 is designated as a hospital scene.
Very good.
And the scene that's checked is designated as a scene where I actually respond to an outdoor or a scene outside of a hospital.
Very good. All right. And as you go through and are noting what you observed, you were asked about the body of Cooper and the clothing of Cooper on direct, and you noted that when you looked at the blue shorts, and this would be on the page 2, I guess it's page 1 of 3 of your report after the cover sheet, if you will. You noted that he was wearing in a gray, green, black sleeveless shirt, slightly wet on the posterior, and the blue shorts are also slightly wet on the posterior, correct?
Yes.
So those items were not, you didn't categorize them as soaked in any way, there's some slight wetness to it.
That was what, yes,
And
sir.
it's right around where the edge of the diaper would have been, is that correct? And
And
looking
on the
at-
back of the shirt.
and on the back of the shirt, very good. Also where the edge of the diaper would have been. There there's the, state's 57. The design on the shirt, I just want you to kind of make sure we're clear, don't want anything to be confusing here. There's some darker gray on the front of the shirt as opposed to the lighter gray in the back of the shirt. That dark gray is not indicating wetness of the shirt, that's just part of the design of the
Yes.
shirt. And then you talked about the, looking at the abdomen, and you noted that there's only a light green discoloration of the abdomen, correct? And that's something that typically you note when you come to a scene to try to see what might be happening inside the body.
Yes.
Is that fair to say? All right. And then you also noted the red discoloration consistent with morbidity that you're seeing, that you
Yes.
already talked about, correct? All right. Now, you indicated that you had attempted to get some information from Ms. Harris. I don't see that noted in your report. Am I missing that? Is that in your report
Yes, it's in the
somewhere?
report where I made contact. It's on page 2 of 3.
Uh-huh,
And it's there, first, the fourth paragraph there,
uh-huh.
where
Very
it
good.
says I made contact with her.
What's the date of that? I don't see a date of that.
I don't recall. It would have been the same day. It would have been probably June 19th.
Okay. The day after you were at the scene?
That's correct.
Okay. And did you just call her on the phone, or did you go see her? Or
No,
how
I
did you
called her on
contact
the phone.
And I take it this probably wasn't a very long conversation?
No, it wasn't.
All right. And did she indicate that she was in the process of making funeral arrangements and things of that nature?
Yes, she gave me a funeral.
Very good. And so she did give you that information? Okay. And was there something particular that you asked her for that she just wasn't able to get for you at that point in time?
Well, I asked her, does Cooper have any type of medical history? Does he have asthma? Is there anything that he's being cared for at the moment? So that what I try to do is try to get information from the family as far as medical history to give to the medical examiner that he can take into account when he's doing the examination.
Okay. And you were saying did she refuse to talk to you, or she just indicated she was busy doing some other things?
No, she just indicated that I should get that information. She had already given that information to someone, and that I should get that information from that.
Perfect. Okay. And were you aware that her husband had been placed in custody?
I was aware that he was being interviewed by the police department. Yes.
Okay. Well, this is on the 19th, the next day. Were you aware of him actually being held in custody overnight and already charged by that point in time?
I don't know about charge, but I knew that he was being interviewed by the police department.
Fair enough. And so she referred you back to the folks she'd already given the information to, and you in fact got that information from them?
Yes.
Very good. All right. And once you looked at these records, medical records, there's absolutely no indication of any prior abuse or any sort of issues of that nature with Cooper Harris, correct?
No, typically I get the medical records and the doctor will review the medical records and we
Okay.
get to see them.
So you did not even look at the records?
Well, I looked at them, but
Okay.
he's the one that does that.
All right. But you indicated to Mr. Evans that after getting these records that he was an otherwise healthy young boy.
Mhm.
I took that to mean you'd actually looked at the records. You did not?
Yeah, well, actually I spoke to his primary care physician here stated, and he advised me that he was a normal, healthy child.
I got you. You got it directly from the doctor.
That's
itself.
correct. Mhm.
Very good. All right. And nothing's ever been pointed out to you to document anything the records indicate, anything other than that?
No,
Cooper
sir.
was well taken care of.
Yes, sir.
All right. On June 19th, also part of your duties was contacting Detective Stoddard, Cobb County Police, requesting a copy of the investigation report. And that's also pretty standard,
Yes.
something you go ahead and ask for.
It's just the initial report.
Very good. And in fact, you got something that very day, correct? And you recall what it was that you received?
It was just the initial report, initial scene report, initial report.
Did it indicate if there were charges that were taken?
I don't remember, no, sir.
Do you have that in your file anywhere by chance?
I have to look and see.
Okay, if you'll look, see, that'd be great.
I have several incident reports from the police department here.
Are you able to tell which one is one you actually got on the 19th?
I don't remember which one I got. Actually, it'll be this one here. 619 on it.
All right. The next day, the 20th, there was a meeting with the Cobb County Police Department at the medical examiner's office. Is that correct?
Yes,
And you were present for that also.
yes.
And present for that were Sergeant Sanowski, that I may or may not be pronouncing that
Yes.
correctly. I'll spell it for the court reporter. Szeniawski. And Lieutenant Farrell and Detective Stoddard were present, correct?
Yes.
All right. And did they discuss with y'all their views of this investigation at that point in time?
Is that the investigation was ongoing, it was still an investigation, and it was still doing their investigation.
Very good. And was there indication, or were you made aware that charges had actually already been taken at that point?
I don't know about taking, but I know they were considering.
All right, very good. And as you spoke to them, of course, Dr. Frist, who was a medical examiner, was talking about the autopsy findings themselves, correct?
That's correct.
And with regards to the next time that you met with law enforcement, July 24th of 2014, another staffing was conducted with members of the Cobb County Police Department, your office, and the District Attorney's Office, right?
Well, actually, that's a typo, that should say June 24th.
June 24th, okay, very good. So now we're 6 days later, correct? Or 6 days after the incident on the 18th. And when y'all do an autopsy, is it typical within a week of doing that autopsy that you're at the district attorney's office, meeting with the DA to discuss those findings?
Not typical, in some cases, but not typical.
And particularly having a staffing with both the police department and the DA's office and your office, that's even less typical. Now, on the report that you received on the 19th, I presume you've seen this, but I'll double check, let you look at that. When I was looking at that, on June 26th, 2 days later, you're getting further reports from Detective Stoddard, is that correct?
Yes.
And then on July 8th, you talked about going out to the Cumberland Parkway area where they were doing some testing to see that it was hot outside, correct? And you indicated, I think, that was with the Cobb County Police Department. In actuality, did you meet with the investigators from the Cobb County District Attorney's Office?
That's correct.
Do you remember there being any Cobb County Police Department personnel there?
Yes.
Okay, who was that?
Detective Stoddard was present.
Let me give you back your report from what you received on the 19th, and I just want you to review that and see if you were made aware on the 19th that in fact charges were taken against Mr. Harris, particularly a homicide charge, maybe noted on the front page.
No, I wasn't aware.
Okay. You didn't note that at the time you received that report?
Didn't note it, no.
Okay, all right. Do you see it noted on that report on the top of the page?
Okay, now I do.
But you but you just weren't aware of it at the time. No one made you aware that that decision had already been made.
That's correct.
Now, in your role as an investigator for the ME's office, would you take part at all in kind of discussing with the ME or with the police department about, hey, here's kind of what the scene is telling us, and whether or not this was an intentional act or an accidental act?
I described my scene. I just described the scene. I don't have any say-so on what it may be as far as determination of the medical examiner and the police. I'm just describing the scene.
So certainly in this case, no one asked you your thoughts about it, and typically they wouldn't ask you anyway.
No.
Would it have surprised you, had you known, that in fact charges already been taken before the investigation was even completed?
Well,
I'm gonna object to that. I don't know if it's relevant whether he's surprised or not.
I think we rephrase.
I'll try to rephrase that.
Sorry, a minute.
Thank you. In your experience, does Cobb County Police Department bring charges before an investigation is complete?
well, actually, I don't work with them, so I'm not sure what their process is. My job is with the medical examiner's office.
Okay.
So that's what I focus on, is with that.
Okay. And so would it be normal that you would get a report this quickly in a case like this, the very next day, not even 24 hours later, that you're already getting a report from the police department?
No, I can get reports typically same day on other cases, other type of cases as well.
All right. In your experience, is there an indication that charges have already been taken that quickly?
Uh,
Or do you recall?
I don't recall.
Okay. All right. Moving forward, on September 29th, you then had contact with the police department, again now at Sergeant Knobloch, Knoblouch.
Yes.
Is that pretty correct?
Mhm.
And without going into specifically what he told you, he's giving you further information about what their investigation is showing.
It was just to confirm information that I had previously received.
Very good. All right. And after that, well, let's talk about the autopsy itself. You were actually present during the autopsy, is that correct?
Yes.
And some measurements were made of Cooper Harris. And how exactly was that done?
With the ruler.
Okay. Is that something that you place a ruler up to his body? Do you have a table with a ruler on it, or how?
Both. We do measurements with the body. We have tape, rulers and tape measurements.
Very, very good.
And tape.
And you talked about the rigor mortis being movable on the scene. As you saw him during the autopsy, were you still able to move his extremities at that point in time?
At that time, I was standing to the side. I didn't really manipulate them when they was doing the autopsy.
I got you. All right. And in other words, you don't have to, quote, get your hands dirty, so to
That's
speak,
correct.
doing
We
the
have a
autopsy,
forensic
you're just there
technician.
watching.
Mhm.
And so the actual measurements, was he able to be laid out straight on a table to do a
Yes.
measurement?
Yes.
All right, very good. And that was done with a ruler, a measuring tape? How was
Yes.
that done? Which one?
Both. We have rulers and measuring. We can do both.
Very good. Were any photographs of that process taken to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, not of the measurement process.
All right. But as those measurements are taken, that's being done by the medical examiner, and he's relating the numbers to you, I presume?
No, that measurements were obtained by the forensic technician.
Okay, so there's yet another person who's in the autopsy?
Yes.
I got you. And did you report any of those numbers out in your investigation, or that'd be something that the medical examiner would?
That would be the medical examiner.
Very good. All right. In the midst of the autopsy, we see some of these photographs where Cooper still is wearing the same clothes, and then we see some of these pictures where he's not. And that typical part of the autopsy is that his clothes would be removed, correct?
That would be part of the process.
And typically that'd be part of what you would document the clothing items that he had, correct?
Prior on scene, but not during the examination. Once he arrives to the office and the examination has begun, that's the medical examiner's from that point on.
Okay. And do you recall particularly photographs being taken during the autopsy itself?
Yes.
These photos that you've identified, some of them, correct? I'm going to show you what I label as defense 38, I believe. I'm sorry, 43, thank you. I'll show you what's been marked as fence 43 and shown to the state. Got it in a plastic sleeve here because it's not as same material. Do you recognize what's depicted in that photograph?
Yes.
And is that in fact the clothing and shoes that would have been taken off of Cooper Harris at the time of autopsy?
Mhm.
And does that truly and accurately depict those items as they were taken from Cooper Harris?
Yes.
All right, we would tender states 43, I believe it is.
Any objection?
No objection.
Admitted.
And just tell ladies and gentlemen what's shown in that photograph first of all.
His clothing, his disposable diaper, and brown paper bags that was on his hands and feet.
And notable in his diaper, you noted earlier that you were able to tell there was some urine in it on the scene itself. There's no feces in his diaper, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And obviously you didn't observe anything of that nature on the scene, and when it was taken off of him, that's exactly the condition it was in, correct? All right. May I publish it to the jury? Thank you. And this is done to document exactly the items as they were found at the time on
Yes.
Cooper Harris, correct? Very good. And again, we're seeing a little bit better here, this the change in color of the shirt. That's part of the shirt design, not wetness, correct? After going out to the Home Depot location for the testing of it being hot outside, did you have some further involvement in the case, meeting with detectives or meeting with the district attorney's office?
We met about the measurements of the doll. Yes.
Very good. And do you recall when that was?
I don't recall the date.
Okay, all right. That's not part of your report because it doesn't
No.
have to do with the death itself,
That's
correct? And as far as looking over those measurements, was the technician with y'all to confirm what those measurements were?
The
when we did
technician
it?
was there. He performed. Yes.
I'm sorry?
Yes, the technician was there.
Okay. And so did y'all do this at your office or at the DA's office?
As far as measuring Cooper,
No, as far as measuring the doll.
measuring the doll was done both at our office and it was done at the district attorney's
Okay,
office.
all right. And so the technician was there when that was taking place with the
He
doll?
was there when one of them. Yes.
Okay, very good. And who is that person, by the way?
Eric Bailey, forensic technician Eric Bailey.
Thank you. And did you make any notes at all regarding the measurements of the doll, what the actual measurements were?
No, he made the notes.
Okay. He being Mr. Bailey?
Yes.
And as far as your reporting, other than what you testified to, this report you made from the scene, would that have been made within a couple days of that scene investigation?
The initial, I like to update my reports so you can see the different dates. So
Right,
I
right.
typically, when something else occurs, I typically try to keep it updated.
Very good. And so all these meetings and whatnot you testified to would be
That was
noted
just,
on it?
yes.
Very good. And so the last time, when you actually prepared your report and turned it in, was sometime after September 29th, correct?
Yes, when the day the doctor signed it was when the report was complete.
Okay. And do you have that front page with you? And does it appear to be that that's the day that ultimately it was all completed, September 29th?
At the bottom, yes.
Okay. All right, okay, just a moment. ask you about having contact with Sergeant Knobloch on the June 24th. And I think I failed to notice that in your report, that actually carries over to the next page, where you talk more specifically about kind of parts of the investigation. Is that correct?
June 24th with Knobloch.
That's
Spoke with
correct.
Sergeant Knobloch on September 29th.
Okay. On the bottom of page 2, where it says July 24th, I think you corrected it, so it actually should be June 24th. I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself. The bottom of page 2, this is actually meeting with the district attorney's office.
Yes.
Okay, and some Cobb County Police Department personnel.
Yes.
All right. And at that point in time, there were discussions about the investigation, things that had been done in the investigation, correct?
Yes.
All right. And were you made aware of any sort of video evidence that had been retrieved in the case?
Yes, they said video evidence was, yes.
Were you shown any of that evidence?
No, I did not see that evidence.
And were you made aware of some sort of reenactment being done by the police department?
Yes.
Were you present when that was done, that
Yes.
reenactment?
Yes.
All right. And tell me, when did that occur? Was that on that day?
That's on that day.
It was on that day. Okay. And just kind of explain to us, was that at the, what location was that at?
It was at the Cobb County Police Department Evidence Processing Garage. They have a garage area where they use to process evidence or to do an examination of automobiles.
Okay. And was the silver Hyundai Tucson there in that location?
Yes.
All right. And at that point in time, were you just looking at that vehicle, or were people getting in and out of that vehicle?
Me, I was just observing.
Okay.
The police department was doing their.
What did you observe happening?
They was just inside the vehicle, just doing the reenactment as far as position within his position within the car. Evaluate his position within the car.
His being Cooper's?
Yes.
And how many officers would you say were involved in that you recall?
I don't recall.
More than one?
Yes.
Okay. Certainly multiple detectives were there.
Yes.
And any uniformed officers that you recall?
I don't recall.
And were they getting in the back seat of the car as well as the front seat of the car?
Yes, they was looking in the car.
All right. And getting into the back hatch area as well?
They was looking into it. I don't recall someone getting in the back hatch.
Very well. And as far as you recall, if the car seat was still in the car at that point in time?
Yes.
It was. Very good. And how long did that take place?
I don't recall the exact amount of time that it took.
Do you think it was more than an hour or less than an hour?
I don't recall.
Okay. Was it hot that day?
Yes.
Okay. And you don't recall if y'all were stuck out there in the heat for more than an hour or not?
Actually, it was inside of a garage area.
I got you. In that air-conditioned garage
Yes.
area? Very good. And did you take any photographs of that?
No, I did not.
Did you notice anybody taking any photographs of that?
I don't recall.
I don't recall anybody videotaping any of that.
No, I don't recall. I was there just to document information for the medical exam.
All right. And it's fair to say you didn't document exactly what they were doing, you just remember they were getting in and out of the car and looking around it in different ways.
Well, I documented where they evaluated his position within the vehicle, within the car seat in the vehicle.
Okay. Specifically how that was done, though, do you remember how that was done? All right. Did anyone ask you any questions about any of the things that you had seen at autopsy or measurements or anything like that at that point in time?
No, just to, our office.
All right. And that shed is actually right directly behind y'all's office, is that right?
Actually across from our office.
Across from, very good. And are you able to see the shed from your office?
If you come to the front of the office, you can.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Where you actually sit day to day, you don't have a window looking out?
Not me, no, I don't.
You don't have any idea how many times they may have been back and forth out there?
I have no idea.
All right. You recall at some point, some requests of some biological slides being prepared and provided to us.
I do.
In fact, you and I met, I think that's how we met, was
Yes.
at Medical Examiner's office.
Yes.
For those are what we refer to as histology slides,
Yes.
correct? And that's a process whereby various organs that are taken to autopsy or some cross sections are made so that we can keep track of what the condition of those organs were at the time of death.
Well, that's the doctor's expertise as far as that goes.
I understand. Are you familiar with what they are, I guess is what I'm asking?
Yes.
Okay, and is that what they are?
Yes.
Okay, very good. And you actually provided those to us so that we could then look at them ourselves,
Yes.
correct? And did you provide those to Dr. Frist as well?
Yes.
Very good. And he was no longer the medical examiner at that point in time, is that right?
That's correct.
All right. I think that's all I have right now. Thank you very much, Investigator Jackson.
Just a few follow-up areas, Investigator Jackson. When you first arrived on the scene at Acres Mill, was the crime scene tape already up?
Yes.
Okay. And obviously Investigator Shumpert was there while you were there, so it was being processed as a crime scene.
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Did you actually go inside the vehicle at any point on June the 18th, or did you just remain out of the vehicle and deal with Cooper Harris's body?
I remained out of the vehicle, but I did look in the vehicle.
I want to talk a little bit about the medical examiner's role versus police department's role versus district attorney's office role. Each one of these entities are separate organizations. Is that fair to say?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, but you and I, for instance, known each other for years, so this
Yes,
is
sir.
not our first time meeting with each
No,
other.
sir, it's not.
Okay, and in fact, who's the on-call major crimes prosecutor for the DA's
That'll
office?
be you, sir, yes.
Have you ever had me respond to a crime scene or attend autopsies with you?
Yes.
So is there anything out of the ordinary of the DA's office and police department meeting with the medical examiner's office, or is that something we occasionally do in homicide
We
investigations?
occasionally do.
Okay. And in fact, on the June 24th meeting, just to be clear, was I one of the persons that was present with Detective Stoddard and you, the medical
Yes.
examiner? Who among these agencies is typically responsible for the charges? Does the medical examiner's office charge somebody, or is that another agency?
That's another agency.
Y'all don't have arrest powers or anything
No,
like
we
that?
do not.
And you were asked some questions about people being arrested and the timing of arrest. Have you ever arrived on another homicide case where somebody's already in custody, say in a domestic violence case or something like that?
No.
Okay. I mean, have arrests been made prior to the completion of autopsy reports in the past in your investigation?
Yes.
Okay. There's nothing out of the ordinary of somebody being arrested prior to the autopsy being
No.
completed. The questions you were asked about measurements and stuff like that, I want to be clear here that the tape measure we're talking about is like a tailor's tape measure that's flexible. Is that
That's
correct?
correct, yes.
So it can bend with the joints in the body and things like that. It's not like a carpenter's tape measure.
Yes.
Okay. And then finally, defense counsel asked you a question about, allowing access. When the defense contacted you and contacted the district attorney's office and said, hey, we want to look at certain things, do we make things available to the defense?
Yes.
Okay. And is there anything out of the ordinary about that, about consulting both with the prosecution and the defense if it's requested?
No.
I think that's all I have.
And it's not unusual, as in this case, for the defense to actually ask and request for some things to be prepared, correct?
No, it's not unusual.
And you talked about being separate entities. Your job with the medical examiner's office is to gather objective evidence in a case that can be documented so that it can then be turned over to law enforcement, correct?
Well, my job as a forensic investigator is to document and gather information about the deceased. I give that information to the medical examiner, and yes, we do have conversations with the police. Yes.
Very good. And it's your belief in the fact the separation between the medical examiner's office and the police department is very important so that y'all can do the scientific part dealing with the death and not be influenced by the subjective opinions of the police.
That's correct, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Nothing further.
You're free to go.
Thank you, ma'am.
Next witness.
Dr. Frisk? Judge, before we get started, I know this is going to take a bit of time. I won't be offended in the least if the court interrupts me at the appropriate time for the morning break.
We'll say toward about 20 after.
Sounds good. Thank you, Judge. If you will, sir, please introduce yourself to the jurors and spell your first and last name for our court reporter.
My name is Brian Frist, F-R-I-S-T.
And can you please tell the jury what your background is and how were you employed back in 2014?
In 2014, I was the chief medical examiner in Cobb County. I received my degree of medicine from George Washington University Medical School in 1973. I did an internship in pathology at Montefiore Hospital in New York City from 1970. I'm sorry, an internship at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. from 73 to 74. I then did a residency in pathology from 74 to 77 at Montefiore Hospital in New York City. I then came to Atlanta, Georgia to practice pathology at Northside Hospital. I was there until about 1987 when I took additional training in forensic pathology and joined as an associate medical examiner in multiple counties in the Atlanta area, including Cobb County. In 1999, I became the chief medical examiner of Cobb County and no longer affiliated myself with the other counties. In 2014, I retired.
Okay. And you're now retired as the chief medical examiner, correct?
That's correct.
How long did you perform the responsibilities of chief medical examiner in Cobb County?
From 1999 through 2014.
And you mentioned some terms. I want to talk a little bit about that. In your training, education, and experience as a pathologist, why don't you explain what a pathologist does and what pathology means?
Pathology versus forensic pathology. Pathology in general, you could associate a pathologist as the doctor who in a hospital setting is in charge of the laboratories. He's in charge of microbiology, blood bank chemistry, and hematology. He's also in charge of the surgical suite in terms of who interprets various materials that are removed in surgery. So if someone were to go to surgery and have a biopsy or a portion of an organ removed, it is the pathologist who will interpret the results and determine whether something is malignant or benign, inflamed, or whatever it might be. He also will do any autopsy in a hospital situation that is necessary. As you can see, he is dealing with all naturally occurring processes, meaning people get sick, they go to the hospital, various tests are done through the laboratories, they may or may not have to go to surgery, tissues are removed, the pathologist will interpret these, and in some instances, if a patient dies, an autopsy is necessary, and the pathologist does this. So these are all naturally occurring processes. As a forensic pathologist, you take additional training, so you have the background as a pathology of naturally occurring processes and disease, and you take additional training in unnatural causes of injury and death, so that you can make the distinction between a naturally occurring process versus an unnatural occurring process, which seems very simple, but many times it becomes very subtle.
And in your experience, you've been trained both as a pathologist and as a forensic pathologist, so you've had that additional training, correct?
That's correct.
And a forensic pathologist is typically what the jury would be familiar with in terms of the medical examiner's role, and just from their common understanding. Is that correct?
That's correct. You could look at the public now. You've seen all these TV programs, CSI and Quincy, and these type of programs. Those are medical examiners. Those doctors are medical examiners.
All right. And have you been tendered as an expert in the field of forensic pathology and death investigations in the past?
Many times.
And have you been received as an expert in Cobb County and elsewhere as an expert in forensic pathology and death investigations?
Many times.
And in fact, just to be fair, two of the defense attorneys over here, Mr. Kilgore and Mr. Lumpkin, both of which have worked as former prosecutors of the Cobb DA's office, you've worked as their expert on prior occasions when they were prosecutors, correct?
Yes, I have.
And in fact, since retirement, has Mr. Kilgore asked you to come in and do any speaking engagements with the defense bar?
Yes, he did. He asked me, at his recommendation, I spoke at the Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers at their winter seminar as to the medical examiner's role with criminal defense.
And is that since having retired from Cobb County?
That's correct.
Judge, at this time I would tender Dr. Frist' in forensic pathology and death investigation.
Any objection?
As noted, we're very familiar with Dr. Frist and have no objection.
All right. I want to talk about death investigations and autopsies in general. Before we get to this case, why don't you start by outlining for this jury what the process is for death investigations, including your role versus the role of an investigator, such as Investigator Jackson, who just testified for us.
Sure. As the medical examiner, the medical examiner is in charge of the individual case. So, for example, if a death occurs in the county, in Cobb County, the call will be made to the Cobb County Medical Examiner's office. At that time, an investigator takes the phone call and takes the initial information surrounding the death. He may or may not need to go to the scene if a scene is available or not, or he may go to the hospital where a body may be. He'll go wherever he needs to retrieve the body and gather information. The investigator then will bring the body to the Forensic Science Center in Cobb County, at which time I will see the body for the first time. I've spoken to the investigator, though, prior. In other words, as soon as the death is called in, he will tell me what's occurred, what he believes is going on, and then he will go to the scene or the hospital to retrieve the body. After he has gotten the body and it's brought back to the Science Center, I will discuss the case with the investigator and get all the information that he knows surrounding the death. I'll then instruct him if any other information I need so that he can get it. And he also knows that he's free and to gather any more information that may come available. Plus, sometimes we don't know what's going to happen, and we'll get phone calls later on about a given death, and he will be the person who will take those initial calls. At that time, after getting that information, I will view the body for the first time. I will have initial impressions as to what has occurred. I will photograph the body. I'll make diagrams of the body. Then any evidence that's with the body will be gathered, photographed, and documented. Then the body will be undressed, and I will look at the body again thoroughly to look for any injury patterns or injuries that the body may have or may not have. Additional photographs are taken, additional measurements are taken, and then the body is cleaned. And once the body is cleaned, it's looked at again, because many times, if the body is dirty or soiled, it may mask an underlying injury. We may not be able to see it. So once you wash the body, then you're able to see anything else that may or may not be there. Additional photographs are taken, additional diagrams are made, and at that point, that portion of the examination is called the post-mortem examination, meaning that I've looked at the body, gathered all this information, but I really haven't done anything to the body. I have not made any incisions. I have not manipulated any internal organs. I have left the body as is. That's the post-mortem examination. Then the internal examination is performed, which the lay public refers to as the autopsy. The body is opened surgically, and all of the internal organs are looked at and dissected to determine whether any injury has occurred, any disease process occurred, or what's going on, what has happened to this individual to cause his death. After that portion of the exam is completed, I've taken from each of the organs a little bit of tissue, which I will send off to the laboratory that I'm able to look at under the microscope. So I have to wait a period of time for those things to come back, plus additional specimens from the body may be drawn, such as blood or urine, cerebrospinal fluid, any type of tissue that I may think is important to the case. But there are standards that are taken. We always try to get blood and urine to submit to the laboratory to see if there's any chemicals, any drugs, anything that might be in the body that may have contributed to death.
Okay. And you've now delineated between basically two parts of the autopsy process, the external exam versus the internal exam. Is that fair to say?
That's correct.
For both of these portions of the exam, are photographs taken and measurements taken to document your findings?
That's correct. Every injury or any mark that I may see, we'll photograph it, measure it, and document where it is and what it looks like.
And then in terms of the samples that are taken, including cuttings of various organs and things like that, is it routine that the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office would maintain those so that further testing and further examination can be done if requested by the defense or the state?
That's correct.
having talked about autopsies in general, I want to talk about specifically the autopsy of Cooper Harris in this particular case. Did you and your staff perform the autopsy on Cooper Harris in this case?
Yes, I did.
And what was the date of that autopsy?
It was June 2014.
Okay. So it was essentially the day after he was recovered from the Acres Mill Shopping Center.
That's correct.
And who is the investigator that was designated to go pick up Cooper Harris's body such that you could do an autopsy on Cooper the following day?
Martin Jackson.
And explain how that works in terms of investigators versus your role as the medical examiner office. Did you have a staff of investigators and individuals that worked with you?
Correct.
Now, as a threshold matter, looking at Cooper Harris's body, was he preserved after being brought to the Cobb Medical Examiner's office? And how was his body maintained such that he was kept in a preserved state for the autopsy itself?
Yes, once he's brought back to the Forensic Science Center in Cobb County, we have a mortuary and we have a cold room where the bodies are kept so that they are maintained to the best of our ability. And that would be the standard across the country.
Was his age determined?
Yes.
And how old was Cooper at the time of his death?
He was 22 months and the body appeared to be consistent with a 22-month-old child.
I want to ask about a description of what you saw first, and then we're going to get into some actual photographs that were taken that you've already discussed.
I think this is a good time to break,
Yes, ma'am.
even if it's a little early, just
Not at all.
sounds texturally correct. So, ladies and gentlemen, close your notepads, keep an open mind, close mouth, and enjoy the break. We'll be at recess for approximately 15 minutes.
Rise for jury. You already rise.
Doc, we have 15 minutes to use the restroom. We'll just hang out here.